Okay, almost there. Hold on. Okay, let's continue on. So again, this is the Renoir 180th birthday live stream art program. Thanks for all of you that are joining us either by Zoom or Facebook Live. If you would like to introduce yourselves, you can tell us your first name, where you're connecting from, and your favorite artist or type of art. And for those of you not familiar with us, we're Washington, D.C. History and Culture. We're a nonprofit community organization. And back before COVID, we used to do all of these in-person programs. Like one of the more popular ones we had was an Impressionism tour at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. The NGA has this fabulous collection of art, including many Renoirs. And so since that was one of our popular programs, we thought we would create a similar one, but for a virtual or online format. And for those of you I haven't met before, my name is Robert Kelleman. I'm the founder and director of the Washington, D.C. History and Culture Organization. And just a little bit about me. In college, I was an art history major at the University of Michigan. And my specialties were Impressionism and American art, my two favorite types of art. And I spent the first 2 years of my career at the Detroit Institute of Arts, which also has a fabulous collection. And you get to see some of those things from the Detroit Institute of Arts and the National Gallery of Art in our program today. So let's go ahead and get underway. Now let's talk about Renoir's art. So these are some of his well-known paintings, which we're going to be looking at as we go through our presentation today, but just as kind of a sneak preview. So I'm guessing a lot of you have probably seen these before and recognize them as being Renoir, but some of you may have seen these before and not known he was the artist for these. So I wanted you just to do a quick overview of some of the highlights that we're going to be looking at throughout our program today. And the reason why we're meeting is because it's Renoir's 180th birthday, born on February 25th, 1841 in France. And so if you haven't done so already, if you could please eat a piece of birthday cake in honor of Renoir, either today or this weekend, that would be greatly appreciated. Thank you. And he lived a long life, passed away on December 3rd, 1919. So we're going to talk about his life and career, and we'll do it mostly in chronological order. These are pictures of Renoir. I always like to include in these art programs pictures, either photographs or paintings, of what the artist looked like as much as possible, because for Renoir, while he's pretty much a household name, not everyone knows what he looks like. So for instance, I'm guessing if I went and showed these pictures to 100 random people on the street, that most of them, unless they were a real art fanatic, wouldn't know who he is, which is in contrast, say, to someone like Van Gogh or Frida Kahlo, the two artists that are very well known in terms of their appearance, not so much for Renoir, even though he's a household name. But, you know, at some point in time, they're going to invent time travel, and it would be a real shame if you didn't know what Renoir looked like. So when you get teleported to 1800s France, I would hate for you to be walking down the street and walk right past Renoir and not even recognize him. So there's two photos of him. And let's go through his life again in kind of like a chronological format, starting with the early years. This is Renoir's parents, and he actually made these two paintings himself. His mom on the left, of course, and his father on the right. What I've done for the paintings is I've included as often as possible the card information. So where the painting is located at, in case you want to go check it out in person, the title of it. The artist, of course, for most of the paintings we'll be looking at today is Renoir, and then the year it was painted. So for instance, this portrait was done in 1860. Renoir was a young man of 19 years old, and his mom was a dressmaker and a seamstress. So that's an important part of our story in just a little bit. Let's look at the portrait of his father. This was done a few years later in 1869. Renoir's father was a tailor. And for our friends in America, just to give you some historical context, the American Civil War was fought between 1861 and 1865. So you can see Renoir is born in 1841. This painting was done in 1869. And this one done in 1860. Hold on for just one second. Okay, so Renoir paints his mom at the age of 19. And for some reason, he did not completely finish this painting. Not sure the exact reason why he abandoned it most of the way through and did not return to it. And then this interesting portrait of his father, you might wonder, why does this dad look so pissed off? Well, because he is. So Renoir during his lifetime was eventually a very successful artist and had a lot of money coming in for the sale of his paintings and for different commissions that he was doing. But at this point in time, as a young man of 28, he's your quintessential starving artist. In fact, his career was going so poorly that he had to move back in with his parents. And his father was not too keen on his artistic career. And so at some point in time, Renoir gets his father to pose for him, and he begrudgingly does so, thus the expression on his face. And Renoir first artistic job before he paints the two portraits of his parents, he worked in a porcelain factory. Initially, he was doing manual labor type activities, but then over time, his career there progressed and he ends up painting the ceramic ware. And here is an example of the type of painting work that would be done. But unfortunately, he ends up losing his job in the Industrial Revolution because they find ways to automate this process and they don't need as many people painting by hand. So Renoir is out of work. But don't worry, he's going to continue on. So I wanted to include, again, a lot of portraits of him so you can get a sense of what he looks like. And this is him as a young man. And this portrait was not a self-portrait. It was painted by his good friend, Frederick Bazille, who was a fellow artist. And this was done in 1867. Renoir is sitting on a chair. And again, he's a 26-year-old young man. So he would have been struggling financially at this point in time. But he looks very astute and serious and determined. Skills that would come in handy throughout his career. This is a painting at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. This is from 1866. And note, this is a very traditional style. This does not look like an Impressionist painting at all. And the reason being is because Impressionism hasn't been invented yet. So again, Renoir, he starts out his career as a very traditional painter, much the same way that many of the Impressionists did. You could say the same thing about his good friend Claude Monet. This is an interesting painting because it's a winter landscape. And while Renoir is mostly known for doing portraits of people, he did frequently do landscape paintings. However, he does not do many in the winter, and the reason being is because he doesn't like cold weather. He basically, to summarize different quotes that are attributed to him and different letters he wrote, basically said, it's not worth going outside and freezing half to death just to make a painting when you can wait for the weather to become nicer. And so this is a very unusual painting because it's a winter landscape. Some artists, including the Impressionists, did winter landscapes, but not so much for Renoir. He hates cold weather. And we'll talk about his dislike of cold weather later on in his life when he ends up moving to the south of France. This painting is in a private collection. And this particular event was they had an extremely cold winter in France this year, and many of the rivers and lakes froze over. And so the people took advantage of this opportunity to go out and skate. Renoir thinks it would be a good opportunity to go out and make a painting, which he does, but he pretty much, like I said, to summarize different quotes and letters, says that it's not worth being outside in the cold to make these types of paintings when you can just wait for the weather to improve instead. And here's a full view. And here's a subsequent view. We had a program earlier today about Renoir at the Barnes. I'm not sure how many of you either saw that today or when we did it last weekend or watched the video that we just posted. But in that program, there was probably like 24 landscape paintings that Renoir had made throughout his lifetime that are at the Barnes Foundation in Philadelphia. All of them are in pleasant weather. There's no winter scenes, there's no rainstorms, anything like that. Okay, let's talk about this young lady, Lies, who she was a model for Renoir from the years 1866 to 1872. And these are 5 portraits of her that he did, which we're going to talk about. He ends up making 23 portraits of her. We don't have time, unfortunately, to talk about all 23, but we'll talk about these 5. So I'll let you look at these. You might have perhaps seen some of these before. This is her sewing. She was born in 1848. So she's 7 years younger than Renoir. When she meets him, she's 18, he's 25. And again, he's not doing well financially with his artistic endeavors at this point in time. They met through a mutual friend. This painting is at the Dallas Museum of Art. It was actually, the ownership of it, you can trace it from her daughter to the Dallas Museum of Art. So that's pretty cool. It has a personal connection back to Renoir. Sometimes paintings go through several ownership changes before they end up at the museum or wherever it is they're on display at. Here's a close-up. And again, he paints 23 known paintings. Renoir, unlike, he destroys actually some of his artwork, which is kind of sort of unusual. Some artists do that and some don't. So they know that he did at least 23 paintings of her. It's possible he might have done more because he was known to destroy paintings that he was not satisfied with. This is from 1868. And a close-up. This is at the Getty Center in Los Angeles. And one of the interesting aspects about this situation is they're not quite sure what her relationship was with Renoir, if it was just strictly a professional relationship or if there was also a personal or romantic aspect to it. There's no consensus one way or the other, but I would say that most people that have looked at this think there was some type of romantic relationship, at least at some point in time during the years that she ended up posing for him. Interestingly enough, when they ended up going their separate ways, neither one of them ever really mentioned much about the other person, in particular Renoir. He doesn't mention her name in letters or interviews or anything like that later on in his life. So some people believe that maybe they had a bad breakup. Here's a close-up of that painting. Now, she ends up having 2 children. The first one, don't know a lot about. He died at a very young age. The second child was a daughter, and interestingly enough, Renoir ends up kind of sneakily providing financial assistance to the daughter for the rest of his life, meaning the rest of Renoir's life, which is kind of more evidence in some people's mind that maybe there was some type of romantic relationship between the two of them. The fact that he had provided financial support, but kind of on a in secret or not in somewhat discreet fashion to her daughter. And this painting is at the Guggenheim Museum in New York. And this is also at the Dallas Museum of Art. This is another painting of hers, painting of Renoir's that she ended up with, the model, and then passed down to her daughter, and then her daughter sold it to the Dallas Museum of Art. And their relationship just suddenly ends in 1872. Now, another interesting aspect of their relationship is she's really the person that helps Renoir become famous, because when she met him, he was a starving artist. And even though he wasn't setting the world on fire by the time they went their separate ways, he was starting to get a fair amount of notoriety. People were hiring him to do portraits of him. So there's a big difference between where his career is at when he meets her and then when they go their separate ways. And you have to consider the fact that because she ends up posing for 23 of these paintings that got him on the map, so to speak, in terms of notoriety or publicity, that she probably should deserve some of that credit. But her name was somewhat lost to history. She's not an unknown figure in the art world, but again, she does have a role in Renoir's kind of getting his first dose of fame. And then again, their relationship ends mysteriously in 1872. And here's a close-up of that. I'm going to hold this up on the screen for a few seconds and let you look at those. Let's continue on. So let's talk about Renoir's relationship with another significant Impressionist artist, Claude Monet. And these two guys are really good friends. They're almost like brothers. In fact, these are 3 portraits that Renoir made of Monet, smoking a pipe and reading in the one on the left and in the center, and then standing next to his painter's palette on the right. This was done in 1872. This is also from 1872. And this is from 1875. Renoir also paints this portrait of Monet outside his garden. Now, this is not his garden at Giverny that Monet is so well known for. He would end up moving to that property several years after this painting was done. But throughout his lifetime, especially as an adult and as an artist, Monet is really fascinated and intrigued by gardens. And Renoir captures that with Monet out painting in his garden. And this painting is at the Wadsworth Athenaeum in Hartford, Connecticut. And again, it was done in 1873. He not only paints his friend Claude Monet, but he also paints Monet's wife and their 2 children. And so this is a pretty well-known painting at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. This is Camille and Claude's son. And I'm not sure what the story is on the rooster, in case someone is getting ready to ask. I don't know if that was their family pet or not. And here's another painting with Mrs. Monet and their youngest son at the time. And I think this was done around 1874, 1876. So in the mid 1870s, Renoir and Monet, they're starting to get some, say, influence and publicity and notoriety in the art world, although they're still struggling financially at this point in time. There's a close-up. Now, some interesting kind of comparisons and contrasts between Monet and Renoir. Let's talk about that. So Monet, in his artwork, he frequently does include people in them. But in the, they say, the second half of his career, he focuses almost exclusively on flowers and his garden at Giverny and et cetera, et cetera. So you don't really see a lot of people in Monet's work, particularly later on in his career, like the second half of his career. And so this is one of his most well-known works. This is Water Lilies. Notice there's no people here. And you contrast that with Renoir's well-known works, which almost always have people in them. So Renoir frequently includes people in his artworks. But if you had to make a list of, like, say, the top 20 or the top 25 most well-known or most popular Renoir paintings, almost all of them would have people in them. So it's really kind of an interesting contrast between the two of them, the emphasis on people with Renoir, whereas Monet is more focused on light and the impact of light and how things change over time, and he wants to capture this moment in time and the light that's impacting it. And let's talk about more of a direct correlation. So these are 2 paintings that Renoir did on the top, and we're going to compare and contrast them with 2 paintings that Monet did of the exact same scene at the exact same time on the bottom. So Renoir and Monet both painted the same scene on the left, with Renoir's on the top and Monet's on the bottom. And then they repeated the process and painted the exact same scene on the right, again with Renoir's on the top and Monet's on the bottom. So does that make sense? There's 2 scenes they're trying to capture, and each artist, Renoir and Monet, each did their depiction of it. And so I set this slide up so you can look at these and again, kind of compare and contrast them. Usually if you're looking at art or talking about art, it's always helpful to look at things side by side or kind of compare things over time. And this is a very good example of that. And as you look at these, kind of what looks similar and what looks different. So let's talk about that. Now, before we do, This was a resort area. So in Paris in the mid to late 1800s, you have a growing middle class, just like you do in a lot of other parts throughout the world, including the United States. And so people have more free time on their hands, and they also have more money available, like disposable income. In, say, the 1700s and earlier, people would have been struggling just to keep their head above water, so to speak. Whereas by this point in time, with the growing middle class, people now have leisure time at their disposal, and they also have disposable income. And so one of the things that they would do would go to like this resort area, and they would do things like boating and swimming and dancing and eat lunches and dinners and things like that. So this is a resort that's outside of Paris that was frequented by the middle class, and Monet and Renoir decided to go there and make some paintings, which they end up doing. And here's the side-by-side view. So Renoir does the one on the left, Monet does the one on the right. And notice Renoir, again, he has more of a focus on people. Notice it's the same exact spot. It's a kind of an island there's a gangplank on the left that you'd walk to get to the mainland. Then there's a bridge, a really tiny small bridge or another gangplank that would connect you to the restaurant. And people would frequently kind of mill about here either upon their arrival to the restaurant or their departure. And you notice that it's the exact same vantage point, but yet Renoir decides to make the people a much larger part of the composition than Monet does, where Monet, he's focused more on the light and how this particular moment in time looked and how he's going to capture it. So again, kind of an interesting comparison and contrast. If you have seen perhaps one of these paintings, but didn't know that the other one existed, they are side by side. This is at a museum in Stockholm, the Renoir one. And again, this is from 1869. This one by Monet is at the Met in New York. There's the Monet one again, and the Renoir one. And then there's a close-up of the Renoir version. And now let's look at these two side by side. So again, the Renoir one is on the left. The Monet one is on the right. Notice Monet is kind of a lot more focused on the light. And he has some people in his painting, but not nearly as many as Renoir does. And not only that, Monet's kind of chopped off that island section that's on the right of the Renoir painting. He doesn't even want to deal with that. And he also has more of the boats in his painting than Renoir was. So these two guys are sitting side by side, or standing, I should say, side by side with their easels, making these two paintings, both of them, the two sets. And so it's just really interesting to see how these two great artists approach this scene. This is the Renoir version in Switzerland. Here's the Monet version in London. And one thing you'd have to think of that if you're an artist like Renoir, wouldn't it be a great learning experience and developmental experience to be spending time with a great artist like Monet and vice versa? And so if these two artists end up becoming so talented and so successful, they probably should give themselves credit for that. Renoir no doubt benefits from being in Monet's company and vice versa for Monet. Okay, let's continue on. So again, we're going to go through Renoir's artwork in chronological order. So let's talk about the 1870s. The 1870s and the 1880s is when Renoir makes most of his well-known paintings. Not all of them, but most of them are done during this 20-year span. So let's dive in and look at some of these. This is a self-portrait that he made in 1875. This is probably the most well-known image of him or well-known depiction of him, and it's a self-portrait. And again, if you contrast Renoir with Van Gogh, they're both household names, although Van Gogh a little more, say, well-known than Renoir. And if you showed a picture of Van Gogh to, say, 100 random people on the street, most of them would recognize who he is. Not so much for Renoir. Oh, hold on just one second. I have to switch something. Okay, sorry about that. I have to keep moving because they're doing the landscaping work outside. And usually they do it in the afternoon, but they got a little bit of a late start today. So I just have to switch positions. But let's continue on. So again, this is probably the most well-known image of Renoir. It's a self-portrait. And again, most people have heard of Renoir. Most people that are familiar with art have heard of Renoir. Maybe not quite as much as Van Gogh, but he's still a household name. But yet, not a lot of people know what he looks like. So I'm guessing if I walked around the National Gallery of Art and showed this picture to a bunch of people, that some of them would know who this is or recognize it, but a lot would not. So if nothing else tonight, you'll at least know what Renoir looks like. Okay, let's continue on. This is another self-portrait of his. This is at the Fogg Art Museum in Cambridge, Massachusetts from 1876. This is at the Detroit Institute of Arts, my former employer. This is from 1874. And a shout out to anyone that's listening from the Metro Detroit, Michigan area. Renoir's finished study of a woman has the quality of a sketch. His rapid brushstrokes describe the play of light across the model's face, arms, and torso. The identity of this sitter remains a mystery. So one of the things that's fascinating about well-known artworks throughout history is that sometimes we know who the person is that's being depicted, and sometimes we don't. So this is a great example. We earlier saw all the images of Lies, Renoir's model slash potential girlfriend, but we don't know who this young lady is. So if you have ancestors that were residing in Paris in the 1870s, who knows, maybe this might be a distant relative of yours. So it's a shame that in many of these well-known paintings, we don't know who the people are in them. So this would be really flattering if this was, your great grandmother or something like that. But unfortunately, we don't know her identity. This is another well-known Renoir. This is in London. This is done 1874. This is the theater box. And again, notice the beautiful fashion and clothing of the young lady there as they're in the theater box. Loge is French for theater box. And then look at her companion. Her date is, what is he doing? Well, he has these opera glasses, and apparently he looks like he's scanning the crowd. I'm not sure what exactly he's looking for, but that's what the story is here. So interesting kind of contrast, the fact that she's looking at us and he's looking off into God knows where. And they're close together, but yet they're distant. They're close physically, but they don't look close in any other way. And then there's this great consistency between the coloring of her dress and the coloring of his clothes. Oh, someone asked to see the title of this painting again. There you go. Yeah, again, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to type in the Q&A or the chat. Okay, so everybody got that? This is called the Parisian. Let me hold on for 1 second again. Okay, again, this is called the Parisian. This is a portrait that's at a museum in Wales. It's from 1874. And now remember earlier we were talking about Renoir's parents and the fact that his father was a tailor and his mom was a dressmaker and a seamstress. And so one of the characteristics of Renoir's artwork is he really puts a lot of attention into clothing and fashion and style. And that's really evident in this great example. Here's a close-up. And the full view. This is at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., Woman with a Cat, pretty aptly titled, and it's from around 1875. Renoir is a big animal lover, so you frequently see cats and dogs in his paintings, not so much many other artists. And so one of the things that's interesting about art is if you just kind of know some of the basics about different artists or different periods or history, you can oftentimes look at a painting and just kind of maybe guess who the artist might be. So Renoir frequently paints people and most often does women. And because he frequently includes cats and dogs in his paintings, if you saw this and had never seen it before, if you could make an educated guess and say, oh, that's maybe a Renoir, you would be correct. Here's a close-up. And I'm guessing that Renoir was familiar with cats because he has that very distinctive cat look, I guess you would call it. The cats can't tell what's the cat's thinking, but it's definitely thinking something. And Renoir has captured that, so you could tell he was familiar with cats. And the full view of that. This is another well-known work of his. This is called The Swing at the Musée d'Orsay in Paris, painted in 1876. And you don't see a lot of men in Renoir paintings. He rarely does paintings of individual men or groups of men. But when he does include men, they're usually, not always, but usually interacting with women. So this is another good example of if you see a painting that has couples interacting, it's not necessarily a Renoir, but you really don't see a lot of individual men depicted in his artwork. There's the close-up. I'll let you look at that for a second. And the full view. Now, this is Renoir's most well-known painting, or one of two well-known paintings. Well, one of three. It's hard to rank artists which painting or artwork is their most well-known or important. But if this isn't the number one, it's in the top five, let's say. And this is from 1876 in the Musée d'Orsay, Paris. And what the scene is here, this is a dance event that takes place. So again, during this point in time in history, there's a growing middle class. People have more leisure time. They have more disposable income. And so they would go to places like this to relax and take a break from work and maybe get a meal and do some dancing, and also to connect with opposite people, opposite sex, and other people that they might not get a chance to mingle with normally. So during this time, socially, it was still frowned upon for men and women that were not married to meet in private, particularly if they had not known each other all that well. And so these dances would give people the opportunity to either meet someone initially, or if they knew someone but not in a serious point in the relationship, they could spend time together. And while it would be out in a public place, there's other people around. If you're dancing, it's somewhat of an intimate type event. You can just talk amongst yourselves and et cetera, et cetera. So these dancing type venues and events become really, really popular during the mid 1800s, not just in France, also in the United States as well. And Renoir has captured that. Let's do this. I'm going to give you a close-up of the top of the painting. This is about the top 2/3. And someone asked, how long did it take Renoir to make his paintings? You know, that answer really varies a lot. So this painting, if he's working really fast, Renoir could do a painting easily within just a few hours. This one, though, would have taken many, many, many days because there's so much going on here. There's so many people in different colors and whatnot. So this would have taken a long time to put together. And again, kind of contrast this with the Monet painting we saw of the water lilies, where there was no people, and Renoir's including lots of people here. And it's interesting how he's captured the animation of the scene. There's quite a few that people are looking directly at us, but some of them are profile views. Some of them have their backs towards us. The clothing is really interesting. So, you know, it almost feels like we're a part of this painting, even though it's slightly impressionistic in the terms it doesn't look like exactly like a photograph of this setting. It almost feels like, wow, we could easily like step right into this scene and start dancing ourselves if we wanted to. So what we're going to do is I have a video clip that talks about this painting in more detail. I'm going to show it though at the end of the presentation. So we're going to come back to this painting just a little bit later. So hold on to that thought. Now, how does Renoir finally get kind of situated as an artist? Well, he ends up doing a lot of portraits. Over time, his reputation grows throughout France, particularly in Paris, and people that are prominent hire him to do portraits of either themselves or their family members. And photography was something that had been around for quite a few years by 1880, but portraits was still kind of the dominant form of artistic depiction for the wealthy. And so these different wealthy individuals would hire Renoir to do portraits either of themselves or their family members. So this is a good example. This young lady was painted in 1880. Here is a close-up of her. And so again, from the kind of early 1870s and beyond, Renoir makes a good deal of money doing portraits, and his fame increases. He can raise the fee that he would charge, and he's also in more and more demand. And so his kind of initial success comes from doing these portraits. And there's a full view of that. Okay, let's talk about a set of 3 paintings that were done between 1875 and 1881, and they're all done in the same location. So that's why I've grouped all of these together. And here are these 3 paintings. So I was talking before about Renoir's most well-known paintings. I would include the one in the center and the one on the right on that list as well of his well-known works. And again, I'm going to talk about all 3 of these in this section because these are all painted at the same exact location outside of Paris. So let's talk about that. Here's the first one. This is the Rower's Lunch. It's at the Art Institute of Chicago, painted in 1875. This is Luncheon of the Boating Party from 1880 or 1881. And this is Two Sisters, also at the Art Institute of Chicago from 1881. And here's the venue where these are painted. So these were done at a restaurant outside of Paris. I'm not going to read the text on the right. I'll let you do that if you want to. And so again, you have this growing middle class. And so people have days off on the weekends, and they have disposable income that they can go do things like go to restaurants with their friends and eat lunch. Whereas before, 50 or 100 years before, you wouldn't do that. They didn't really have a lot of restaurants, say, at the turn of the century from 1799 to 1800. But at this point in time in the 1870s, they do. And so people are frequenting them, particularly people of the bourgeoisie, and Renoir and the Impressionists are depicting it. Now, this restaurant still exists today. Here's a map of Paris, and you can see it's kind of northwest or west of Paris. And if you look at the map closely, that's the Seine River that serpentines from the top left through the map down into Paris. And this restaurant is right along the riverbank. Here's a close-up view. Now it's closed, or at least the last I checked was closed because of the COVID situation. But notice where it's situated. It's right on the river. And if you were to, the picture angle is you'd be in the center of that blue box looking towards the right or looking towards the east. This is what this restaurant looked like back in the day. And the spot where the paintings were made is kind of in the center of the photo. You see where the awnings are. So the restaurant has this outdoor space, which was very popular, particularly in nicer weather. You could sit out there and have a lunch and interact with your friends and whatnot. And then they had all these boating type activities that would take place out on the river. Here's another view of the restaurant, but this is from modern times. But you can still see the awning there, kind of in the center right of the photo. The bank of the river has been changed a little bit by engineers, but You get the effect. Now, when Renoir would have painted this, this was much more of a rural area. So now the Parisian sprawl is kind of engulfed this whole entire spot. But back when Renoir was here, this was more of like the countryside. But people would go out here for a good time and get away from the urban hustle and bustle. Here's another modern view of the restaurant today. Again, right along the river. It's a two-story establishment. And throughout France, like many parts of Europe, because there's been so many great paintings there created throughout history, not just by Renoir, but by all different types of artists, whether it's Van Gogh or Monet or Rembrandt, they frequently put up historical markers, kind of signifying the fact that, hey, this important artwork was made here. And that's what they've done here. So living in Washington, D.C., it's really cool to go to this spot and see this historical marker and then say, hey, that's the painting that's at the Phillips collection in Washington, D.C., where I live. So really neat that they've taken the time and effort to do that. And here's another view of the restaurant today. And let's go inside. So if you go upstairs, this is what it looks like now. So again, the view today is not quite as impressive as it would have been during Renoir's time. You wouldn't have had those buildings on the other side of the river. And you also wouldn't have had that big railroad bridge, that green line that's on the right side of the painting. That was not there when Renoir was living and painting here. Someone who didn't care about paintings decided the railroad needed to run through here. And then depending on the size of your screen, there's another bridge beyond that, an automobile bridge. And there's another view. And another view. Okay, so you get the idea. That's what the restaurant looks like. So here's Renoir's painting, The Rower's Lunch, and there's three people. They probably went out boating for the day, again, using their leisure time. And now they're just going to relax and have lunch. And, you know, maybe they'll continue their boating and maybe they're done for the day. And then in the background, you can see two boats out there. One looks like a canoe and the other one looks like a rowboat with kayakers. And you just have these three people, two men and a woman, just kind of sitting around relaxing. Now, this is an interesting painting as far as Renoir goes, because frequently in his paintings, the women are the center of attention or the focal point of the paintings. And while the woman here is kind of sort of in the center more so than some other people, it's the guy, her companion on the other side of the table. He's really kind of the person who our eye is drawn to because he's facing us. He's got the white shirt. He's in the more the center of the photo or center of the painting. So this is really an interesting depiction. The subject and style composition is a lot different than many other Renoir paintings. Here's a close-up. Here is Luncheon at the boating party. This is kind of like a smaller scale version of the dance party that we saw earlier. It's just a fewer number of people, but all these people interacting and having a good time and whatnot. Frequently in paintings, you see people doing work like digging ditches or working in factories and stuff like that. You don't really see that in Renoir paintings. His people are particularly doing leisurely activities or they're just posing in a portrait type format. So that's kind of another visual clue to be on the lookout for. And this painting is at the Phillips collection in Washington, D.C. Here's a close-up of that. It's perhaps the most well-known and important painting in the Phillips collection. And Renoir's future wife is in this painting, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. She's mixed amongst his friends. And here's a close-up of the left side. And a close-up of the right side. And back to the full view. So again, this is another painting where this would have taken a long time to put together just because there's so much detail. So how long a painting or how long it takes an artist to make a painting, again, that really varies a lot. So Renoir could crank out a painting in a few hours if he wanted to or needed to and would do that frequently. But for something like this, this would have taken a long time. Plus, this is also a very large painting. These figures are pretty much life size. Now, this also is at the same restaurant. This is called Two Sisters. This is at the Art Institute of Chicago. There's a close-up. And just these beautiful colors included in here. One of the reasons why you see such colors in Impressionist painting is because around the mid-1800s, scientists invented ways to make paints out of artificial materials. Prior to the mid-1800s, paint always was made out of natural materials. They hadn't figured out how to use artificial ingredients in paint, but in the mid-1800s they had, and that's important because for a painting like this, say 100 years earlier, it would have been really challenging to get that bright, vivid blue and that bright, vivid red. Those existed, but they would have been extremely expensive. They would have been in short supply. But with the invention of artificial pigments in paint, it really opens up the whole spectrum or rainbow of colors. And so that's one reason why you see so much color in Impressionist paintings. And this is one of the most beloved paintings at the Art Institute of Chicago. And you don't see in Renoir's paintings a lot of negative type things, or you don't see death or destruction or poverty or anything like that for the most part. His paintings are usually happy thoughts and people enjoying themselves and whatnot. He did that on purpose. He talked about, I'm going to kind of paraphrase different quotes that he said or letters that he wrote, but he basically said, you know, there's enough misery out there in the world that people don't need to see more of it in my artwork. I want to show people a happy world because people need more happiness. And so I think that's one reason why his work is so popular, is because it's not giving us bad things or negative things. The world's just this beautiful place that's depicted through these beautiful colors when you look at Renoir's paintings. Okay, let's talk about this set of 3 paintings that Renoir did in 1883. And again, more people enjoying their leisure time. So these are 3 couples dancing. These were all done at the same time. This one is at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. Here is a close-up. Another interesting thing to be on the lookout for with Renoir is he frequently includes people in the background like he does here, but they're just kind of like an add-on, like the people in the foreground, the 2 dancers, they're kind of lost in their own moment. And yeah, there's these other people here, but they're not interacting with the dancers. In fact, it doesn't even look like they're paying them any attention. And so you frequently see people kind of in the background of a Renoir painting, but they're not really interacting with whatever the subject is. That's kind of another characteristic to look for if you're trying to tell if a painting is a Renoir or not. This is Dance in the City. And again, dancing has been popular for a long time, but particularly in the 1800s, it becomes even more so just because, again, it was frowned on for men and women that were not married to spend time in private. And so dancing forms a way for you can kind of get close to and talk intimately or privately or in secret with someone while yet still kind of being out in a public space. So it's kind of a mix of kind of a private event, but yet in a public space, or I should say a semi-private event, but in a public space. And here's another dance. This one, notice the hat's fallen off and is on the bottom right corner. And then there's people peeking out through the left. Oh, and someone asked a great question that I have to go back and show you. So the question was, is that Vincent van Gogh? No, it's not. So Renoir and Van Gogh didn't know one another, but so that's not Vincent van Gogh in the painting, just a guy that looks like him. That hat in the tire was commonplace during this point in time. Van Gogh, when he arrives in Paris, Renoir had already kind of left the scene, so to speak, and moved away. Now, the first one I showed you is one of the centerpieces of the Museum of Fine Arts Boston, and it was somewhat challenging to find pictures of how some of these paintings were displayed or are displayed, but I had pictures of this one. So here's from far away, and you'll notice on the left, that's the Degas dancer. And then you move closer, and you might recognize that's Van Gogh's Postman to the left of the Renoir. And it's a Cezanne on the right. And here's a close-up view. So these are really large paintings, just give you a scale sense. I used to include the dimensions of the paintings in these slides, but it's made the slides too busy. So I try and kind of find other ways to show you how big or small the paintings are. If you ever do want to know the dimensions, you can track that down. And then also too, so we're recording this program. So if you ever want to go back and look at these paintings, kind of freeze the frame or whatnot, it'll be on our Facebook and our YouTube page. I'll send out the links afterwards. So if you ever want to scroll through here and stop and say, okay, what was the name of that painting again? You will be able to do so. So this gentleman here gives you a comparison. Now, these three paintings are at two different museums. The one on the left is in Boston, the one in the center and the right are in Paris, but periodically throughout history, they've been displayed at the same time, which is neat that you can look at them all close up and in person. But they're not always displayed this way, obviously, because they're owned by two different museums. And another thing that's interesting is notice how many people there are in these other well-known Renoirs, where this one, there are a lot of people, but really the only ones that matter for the most part are this the young couple, the dancers, and you kind of contrast that with these other well-known Renoir works that just have lots and lots of people. There's like over a dozen people on the bottom, and there's several dozen on the top. And so it's interesting that he chose kind of a different approach to show the dancing on the left, just one individual couple, and on the right, there's all kinds of people dancing, and there's people milling about and watching and eating and drinking, et cetera, et cetera. So really kind of an interesting comparison and contrast between these two. The open-air cafes of suburban Paris were popular recreation spots for city dwellers, including the Impressionists. Here at one such cafe, its floor littered with cigarettes, burnt matches, and a small bouquet of flowers, an amateur boatman in a straw hat sweeps his stylish partner along in a waltz. The touch of their gloveless hands, their flushed cheek, and intimate proximity suggest a sensuous subtext to the scene. The son of a dressmaker and a tailor, Renoir delighted in capturing intricate details of contemporary fashion, such as the woman's red bonnet trimmed with purple fruits. So if you see a painting and the woman is really nicely dressed, and you can tell that there's a lot of attention has been put in the depiction of her and her clothing. It's not a guarantee it's a Renoir, but that's kind of one of his signature characteristics. Okay, let's talk about Mrs. Renoir. So he meets her in 1880 when she starts modeling for him. They met through a mutual friend, and they end up forming a romantic relationship, falling in love, and getting married in 1890. So let's talk about her. And this is a portrait of her from 1883, although at this point in time, it's a portrait of her, but the painting is more about just depicting a person and not trying to give kind of an exact representation of what she looks like. And so this is by the seashore at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York from 1883. Here is a close-up. And the full view. This is at the Hermitage Museum in Russia. This is also her in the garden from 1885. And this is a good example of what I was talking about before, where you don't really see a lot of men in Renoir paintings. And if you do, they're oftentimes accompanying a woman. And so this is a good example of that. This is kind of the opposite of the theater box one we saw earlier, where in both cases, the women, I should have put these up side by side. In both cases, the women are looking directly at us, but in the theater box, the guy was looking through his opera glasses off into God knows where. Where in this one, it's the exact opposite. He's looking at her, and you can tell he's really, really into her. In fact, if you look over in the kind of the center right, he has his arm around her. And again, this is the future Mrs. Renoir. And this is a painting of her from many, many years later in 1910. So she was a great partner for Renoir. She was very supportive of his career. And later on, he starts having a lot of health problems. And she was also extremely supportive during that point in time in his life. And again, interestingly enough, he includes a small dog in this portrait along with her. So the Renoirs are big animal lovers. And interestingly enough, their dog's name was Bob. You don't really see that too often. Here's a close-up, but really a great romantic relationship between the two of them. And she plays an interesting role in Renoir's life because she convinces him to move to her hometown. So she grew up outside of Paris, and the site where the Renoirs live in as a married couple, you can go visit. It's now a museum. So here's a TripAdvisor review for that. And this is a map that'll show you where it's at. So southeast of Paris. And here's the distance. So this place makes a great day trip. In modern times, you can get there in like 2.5 hours, depending on what traffic and road conditions are like. However, in Renoir's time, the trip back and forth from there would have taken almost a full day because they don't have cars and freeways and stuff like that like they do now. So initially, when they get married, she wants to make this area her hometown, her former place where she was living at, where she was born and raised. She wants to make that their kind of home base, so to speak. And Renoir does not want to do that. He wants to stay in Paris full time. And he basically is telling her, listen, it's too far away. Everything in the art world is centered in Paris. I'm an artist. All the galleries and salons and dealers are in Paris. All the people that hire me to do portraits, they're all in Paris. And where you grew up at is just way too far away. But eventually she keeps working on him and he ends up finally relenting and moving out there. And they set this up as their kind of quote unquote home base. Now they still had a residence in Paris, but they start spending a lot of time out here, much more so as time goes by. And I'll let you read the description there on the right if you so to choose. So it's a really interesting because while he's reluctant to move out there initially, over time, the area really kind of grows on him and he ends up really liking it a lot. And so this is kind of a good example of the woman knows best for Pierre-Auguste Renoir when he took his wife's advice and set up a house out here. It's in the Champagne area of France. And they have a lot of artwork. They're really proud of the fact that Renoir spent so many years living here. And so as you walk around town, you can be on the lookout for things. You know, this is really neat that they do this type of thing throughout Europe. They do this to a certain degree in America as well and other places of the world, but much more so in Europe, in my opinion, than other places. You're just walking down this random street and see this. And this is the visitor center side of the site. And it has like museum exhibits about Renoir in his life here. So this is a place that you can go visit. So this is mostly like an art history presentation, but I want to include some travel stuff for you to have something to look forward to when COVID ends. You can go to France and check out this Renoir site. And this is the house that they lived in. So at this point in time, his career is doing very well. He's not a millionaire, but he's also not poor either. So he has a steady stream of money coming in, both from the sale of works that he created, and also he was continuing to do the portraits, and including doing them more and more for people that were of, say, high net worth type individuals, the one percenters. Well, maybe not the 1%, maybe more like the 5 percenters and the 10 percenters. And so his revenue or money that's coming in at this point in time is not substantial, but it's enough to easily afford a place like this. And they have his studio set up here. So kind of interesting to go here and think that Renoir would have made all these cool paintings in this room. That's his chair on the right. And then if you were posing for Renoir, you could sit over on the chair on the left in different poses while he painted you. And another view of the studio. It's neat how they have it set up. Sometimes when you go to museum home, they it's really pristine. It doesn't look like anyone's living there. This one, because the way they have the paints and stuff kind of laying about, I mean, it looks like he just got up and walked away for a minute and is going to be coming back any second now. And interestingly enough, he's buried in this town. So we're going through this presentation of his life in chronological order, and we're a ways away from the end, but I didn't want to talk about where he's buried at just because he's buried in this particular spot. So that's his grave site in the center of the photo. And then it may be a little bit hard to see, but if you look behind his grave site, that's the grave of his wife. So they're side by side, but side by side vertically, not horizontally. And unfortunately, there used to be a sculpture of her that he designed himself that was on her grave marker, but someone stole it, and unfortunately, the cemetery has never replaced it. And there's a sculpture of him. So again, the guy who reluctantly moves here with his wife ends up falling in love with this area. He likes it a lot, and he ends up being buried here. Now, his wife, she was considerably younger than he was, but she passed away before he did, which may have influenced the decision to be buried here. Okay, let's talk about Renoir's later years. This is another self-portrait that he did. It's at the Clark Art Institute in Massachusetts. He was 58 when he painted this. This is a self-portrait he did when he was 69. And another one when he was 69. Later on in life, if you notice how much it looks like he aged, he had a lot of health issues the last, say, 10 or 20 years of his life. Okay, this is a beautiful painting at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. Young girl in a pink and black hat. And again, this is a great example of Renoir's sense of fashion, the son of a tailor and a dressmaker, being all too familiar with women's clothing and the different types of accessories he uses. It's interesting to see how many hats are included in Renoir paintings. And this particular painting has an interesting story. Renoir frequently likes to include hats and other accessories in his portraits of women or his paintings of women. And this particular one he took to Paris and showed it to the dealer there. And the dealer says, hey, yeah, be careful with the hats because that particular hat is not in style anymore. It went out of style like a year ago. So be careful doing portraits or paintings of women that have hats, and to make sure you use one where the hat is still in style, Pierre. But it ended up selling nonetheless. Beautiful painting with the pinks and blacks. Here's a close-up view. Beautiful view. So if you see a beautifully dressed woman or a woman with a really cool hat or some type of headwear, it may be a Renoir painting. Not certain, but maybe. Another interesting thing about Renoir is he does a lot of nudes, but he also does a lot of paintings of women doing kind of intellectual activities, whether it's playing musical instruments or reading. And so these are two young girls. And, this may not seem like that big of a deal now, but in the late 1800s, women had much more of a domestic role than they do now. And so the fact that Renoir is frequently having them portrayed doing things like reading and playing musical instruments, as opposed to doing, laundry and cooking and all that kind of stuff. So really kind of progressive in that regard. This is the Metropolitan Museum of Art, Two Young Girls at the Piano from 1892. This is Blonde Girl with a Rose. We're now getting into the later years of his career. He did a great job of kind of blending the colors of her and the flowers and the clothing and the chair that she's sitting on in the background. It all, the colors are all complementary, but yet they contrast enough that you can identify the different elements of the painting. Okay, let's talk about Renoir's later home. So he's again living in his wife's hometown outside of Paris, and he likes that area a lot. The problem he has, though, is Renoir does not like cold weather, as I was talking about earlier. And later on in his life, he starts suffering from arthritis. And I've never had arthritis, fortunately, but what I've had people tell me is, it really varies a lot. There's mild cases and extreme cases. And his, by the end of his life, is extremely severe. And so he goes to doctors, try and get different treatments. And one of them tells him that, this cold weather up in the northern France is not good for your arthritis. Perhaps you should consider moving to a warmer climate like the south of France. And Renoir, who's never liked cold weather, even when he was a young man painting that winter landscape scene, thinks that, oh yeah, that's probably a good idea. And so they moved down to the south of France in the early 1900s. And then in 1907, they purchased this home. And it's another site that you can visit. So again, kind of the travel portion of our presentation tonight, kind of give you some ideas of things that you can go check out when the world returns to normal, which it seems like it's headed in that direction, unfortunately, thank God. And this is the Musée Renoir in the south of France. And that's the house that he was living in. And for the people that are not familiar with this part of the world's geography, there it is. And it's located between Nice and Cannes. And if you look up at the top right of the map, you can also see Monaco. And notice how where the kind of the red dot is, it's not right on the coast, but you can actually see the Mediterranean from his house, which is pretty cool. And here's the entryway. So if you go to this part of the world, got to check out the beach and all that kind of stuff, but make sure you go a little bit inland to the Renoir Museum. The Renoir Museum lies in the heart of a beautiful estate planted with olive and citrus trees, offering a breathtaking view. So again, he moves down here because of his arthritis. If you can't read French, basically what the placard on the left says, or the sign on the left says, that Renoir lived from 1841 to 1919. He moved here in 1907 and died in 1919. His wife, unfortunately, who was 18 years younger than he was, actually passed away 4 years before he did. He spent his last 12 years here. And here's the view. So you may not be able to tell, depending on the size of your screen and other factors, but you can see the coastline off in the distance. So kind of where the colors, where it's really dark, is like the buildings and the shoreline and stuff. And then where the colors are all of a sudden like a whitish light blue, that's the Mediterranean and the sky. It's kind of all blended together in this particular image. But so again, you can see the water from his estate. And it's known as the grounds are just a really popular attraction. It's beautiful with a lot of citrus trees and olive trees and things like that. So you can go walk around here. And this is the house. So again, he's not a millionaire during the later years of his life, but he's doing very well. And so he was even doing better now than he was when he bought the other house, which is why it's considerably larger. And again, this isn't the state of the top 1% of society, but he's a long way from the guy who had to shack up with his parents because he couldn't sell his painting. It's unfortunate that Renoir's parents did not live to see how successful their son would become. And his story really parallels that of Monet. Monet also was a starving artist for many, many years, and it wasn't until he continued on and kept with it that eventually he breaks through financially, kind of around the same time that Renoir does. So a lot of interesting parallels there. I forgot to mention that when Monet was married and with a small child, he lived not far from Renoir, and Renoir was living with his parents at the time. And so what Renoir would do, he was really concerned about the Monets, particularly their son. And so what he would oftentimes do is pack up extra food that they had at his parents' house and take it over to the Monet so they would have something to eat. So he's bringing them fruit and bread and cheese and milk on a regular basis. So the amazing kind of story to think that Renoir is doing that to help keep the Monets fed. And then later on, he's going to live in a place like this. So proof that you just got to stick with it sometimes. And here's the inside of the house. It's nice to go visit this. It's maybe not as filled with as many furnishings as you might expect to maybe see at some other museum type homes, but still a definitely worthwhile place to see. Kind of makes it easier for people to walk through though, when they don't have all that stuff. And has these beautiful window views. And again, Renoir has a number of health issues later on in his life. And it's really admirable the fact that he's pretty much set financially at this point in time. He does not need to keep working, but yet he does. And he's in a lot of pain, particularly when he's painting. He oftentimes needed assistance, putting the brushes in his hands or adjusting the easel, and et cetera, et cetera. So he has to go through quite an ordeal to create artworks, particularly later on in his life, but he keeps on painting till the very end. Here's a picture of him in his wheelchair. And they have this studio set up here so you can get a sense of what that looks like. So again, that's his wheelchair on the right that he could kind of glide around. Over on the right is a box that's had his paints in it. Over on the left is his palette where he would mix the paint. And then of course the easel is directly in front of the wheelchair. And then behind that is this sofa that whoever was posing for him could either sit on or lay on or do whatever they were needing to do. Here is another view. And here's all these amazing paintings that we got to see. So again, just really an incredible artist and household name. And I'm guessing that if you're familiar with art, you've probably seen either all or most of the paintings on this slide. But depending on your familiarity with art and Renoir, you might not have known that they were done by him. When I've talked to people on our tours in National Gallery of Art, frequently people show up and like, oh yeah, I've seen that particular painting, but I didn't know who the artist was. And so now hopefully you have a chance to do that. So let's do this. I'm going to show a couple of videos, but because of copyright issues, I have to disconnect the people that are watching on Facebook. I apologize for that. Facebook doesn't let us record and stream video content that we don't own. So I'm going to show two short videos. If you are getting bumped off and you're on Facebook, it's not the end of the world. It's only going to take a few minutes. But I do unfortunately have to disconnect the Facebook folks. But if you are on Facebook, you're only missing like the last 4 or 5 minutes of the presentation. So thanks for joining us, all our Facebook friends. Let me disconnect that. Hold on one second.